There is a moment in every serious geopolitical realignment when the shift stops being theoretical and starts being structural, when it is no longer a question of whether the old order is changing, but of how quickly and who position themselves well enough in advance to benefit from the change rather than absorb its costs. I believe we are watching that moment unfold right now in the North Atlantic and Indo-Pacific economic order. And the country at the center of it is not the one you would expect if your frame of reference was formed in the last century. It is not the United States, which built the post-war trading system and has spent the past several years treating it as a negotiating inconvenience. It is Canada, a country that most Washington strategists have historically viewed as too small, too accommodating, and too economically dependent on American goodwill to ever act as an independent force in global trade architecture. That assumption is being methodically dismantled, and the instrument of its dismantling is a trade bloc that Canada is now actively leading, connecting the European Union, the CPTPP member economies of the Indo-Pacific, and a growing coalition of what Mark Carney, with deliberate precision, has been calling the Middle Powers. When I watch what is happening here with the kind of analytical distance that the moment requires, what I see is not a diplomatic curiosity or a temporary realignment driven by temporary tension. What I see is the logical culmination of a process that began the moment it became clear that the United States under the current administration was not going to exercise its traditional role as the anchor of the Western trading system. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does global capital. When the anchor drifts, the ships that were tied to it do not simply drift with it. They find another anchor. And Canada, through a combination of institutional competence, strategic patience, and the kind of long horizon planning that is genuinely rare in contemporary democratic governance, has spent the past year positioning itself to be that anchor. Let me walk you through what is actually happening, because the public narrative has not done justice to the scope of what is being built. The surface story is familiar enough. Trump imposed steep tariffs on Canadian goods. Carney pushed back, traveled to Davos, delivered a speech that framed the current moment as a rupture in the rules-based international order rather than a temporary disruption. Trump responded with escalating threats, including the extraordinary proposition of a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods. And through all of that, Ottawa continued doing something that was easy to miss in the noise of the daily confrontation. It was quietly constructing an alternative architecture, 12 trade agreements across 4 continents in 6 months, preliminary arrangements with Beijing on agricultural access, active conversations with European Union leadership about deepening the existing CETA framework, engagement with Australia, New Zealand, and the Indo-Pacific CPTPP bloc about building what Carney explicitly described as a trading alliance capable of operating independently of American policy volatility. Now, I want to be careful here about the distinction between what is being built and what it is being called, because precision matters in this analysis. What Canada is leading is not an anti-American alliance. Carney has been explicit and consistent on this point, and I think the consistency itself is strategically significant. He is not positioning Canada as an adversary of the United States. He is positioning Canada as the organizing principle of a trading community that shares a commitment to rules-based exchange, predictable frameworks, and the kind of long-term investment environment that multinational capital requires in order to make decade-horizon decisions. The implicit argument is that this community will be defined by those values, regardless of whether the United States chooses to participate. And that implicit argument is the most devastating critique of current American trade policy that any allied leader has offered, precisely because it does not require anyone to say anything hostile about Washington. It simply builds the alternative and lets the contrast do the work. This is where I want to spend some time on the institutional mechanics, because this is where the conventional commentary consistently fails to grasp what is actually significant about this development. The bargaining chip that Washington has deployed against Canada for the past year and against any trading partner that has challenged American preferences is market access. The implicit or explicit threat has always been the same: accommodate American demands or lose access to the American consumer base, the American financial system, the American anchored trade frameworks that have structured global commerce for the past 70 years. That threat has been credible because for most of that period, American market access was genuinely irreplaceable. There was nowhere else you could go that provided the same combination of consumer wealth, financial depth, and institutional stability. The threat of exclusion worked because the alternative to American market access was, effectively, economic diminishment. What a functioning trade bloc connecting the European Union, the CPTPP economies, and Canada fundamentally changes is that calculus. Think about what you are actually assembling when you connect those pieces. The European Union is the largest single market on the planet by GDP at purchasing power parity. The CPTPP bloc encompasses 11 economies across the Asia-Pacific, including Japan, which is the world's third largest economy, as well as Australia, Canada itself, Vietnam, Mexico, and Singapore. When you add the bilateral, agricultural, and tariff arrangements Canada has recently concluded with China, the world's second largest economy, you have a coalition that represents, by any reasonable measure, the majority of global economic output outside the United States. That is not a niche coalition of secondary powers hedging against American pressure. That is a trading architecture that could, if formalized, constitute the most significant reorganization of global commerce since the Uruguay round of the GATT negotiations produced the World Trade Organization in 1995. I want to be precise about the current state of this process, because I am not suggesting it is complete or that its ultimate form is certain. What exists today is a framework of conversations, preliminary agreements, and strategic alignments that have not yet hardened into a single unified institution. The conversations between Carney and European Commission President von der Leyen, between Ottawa and the CPTPP members, between Canada and a range of bilateral partners, these are the early architecture of something that could become considerably more formalized if the current trajectory of American trade policy continues. Carney himself has been careful in his public language, describing Canada's role as that of a bridge builder rather than a bloc leader, a country that can broker connections between partners who share values but have not previously had a strong organizational framework for acting on them together. But here is what I think is genuinely important about that framing, and why it represents a more sophisticated strategic posture than it might initially appear. By positioning Canada as a broker rather than a hegemon, Carney accomplishes several things simultaneously. He avoids the kind of confrontational posture that would give Washington a justification for treating the emerging coalition as a hostile formation, requiring a decisive response. He preserves Canada's ability to maintain its existing relationship with the United States while simultaneously building the architecture that reduces Canada's dependency on that relationship. And he creates a model for middle power participation in the emerging order that is genuinely attractive to governments that want to reduce their exposure to American policy volatility without incurring the costs of open confrontation with Washington. That is not naive diplomacy. That is extremely sophisticated positioning, executed by someone who spent years at the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada studying how systems manage transition without catastrophic discontinuity. Now, let me address directly the question of what this means for American bargaining leverage, because this is the part of the analysis that the headline is pointing toward and that deserves the most careful treatment. The bargaining chip that is being lost here is not simply market access or tariff leverage in the narrow sense. It is something more fundamental and more difficult to replace. It is the structural dependency that has made American trade demands credible in the first place. For the past several decades, when Washington told a trading partner that non-compliance would have consequences, the threat carried weight because partners genuinely had limited alternatives. They could push back at the margins, absorb some costs, try to negotiate better terms, but the underlying architecture of the global trading system was so thoroughly organized around American preferences and American institutions that no partner could credibly threaten to operate entirely outside it. What Canada is building challenges that architecture at its foundation. Not by dismantling American institutions, not by creating a rival military or political bloc, but by demonstrating that sufficient economic scale and institutional quality can be assembled outside the American-centered framework to make that framework's threats proportionally less powerful. When you have access to European consumers, Asian manufacturers, Indo-Pacific supply chains, and a growing roster of bilateral arrangements with major economies on multiple continents, the prospect of losing American market access becomes one significant cost among several rather than an existential threat. And the moment it becomes one cost among several rather than an existential threat, Washington's ability to use it as an unconditional demand, give us what we want or face isolation, is structurally diminished. This is, in a very precise sense, the loss of the biggest bargaining chip, not because the American market stops mattering. It remains enormous, and access to it remains enormously valuable. But the chip loses its coercive power when the party being threatened can credibly respond, as Carney has effectively been doing for the past several months. We prefer a productive relationship with the United States. We are committed to negotiating in good faith on the genuine issues between our countries. But our economy is no longer organized around the assumption that American goodwill is the singular condition of our prosperity. When that response is credible, when it is backed by 12 trade agreements and an emerging coalition of like-minded economies, the coercive value of the chip approaches zero, regardless of its nominal size. There is also a dimension of this story that involves the private sector in ways that rarely make the front page, but that ultimately determine whether diplomatic architecture translates into durable economic reality. Trade blocs are not simply government arrangements. They are, at their foundation, frameworks that reduce transaction costs for private firms making investment decisions across borders. When businesses believe that a trading relationship is stable, predictable, and governed by rules that will not change overnight, they invest in the infrastructure of that relationship. They build supply chains, training pipelines, distribution networks, and financial arrangements that deepen the integration over time. Those investments then create constituencies, workers, shareholders, communities, local governments, who have a material interest in the preservation of the relationship, and who will resist its disruption even when political leaders might prefer a different course. What the emerging Canada-centered trade architecture is doing, at the private sector level, is creating exactly those constituencies outside the United States. When Japanese automakers route their North American distribution through Canadian ports to avoid American tariff unpredictability, they are not simply making a temporary logistical adjustment. They are building relationships with Canadian port authorities, Canadian logistics firms, Canadian customs infrastructure, and Canadian financial institutions that will accumulate their own momentum over time. When European agricultural processors secure guaranteed access to Canadian canola and grain, they are investing in the processing capacity, the transport arrangements, and the commercial relationships that will make Canadian supply structurally embedded in European food production in ways that persist long after any particular tariff regime has changed. When Indo-Pacific technology manufacturers identify Canada as a stable alternative to American procurement uncertainty, they are beginning the process of qualifying Canadian suppliers, training Canadian workers, and integrating Canadian components into supply chains that will, over a 5 to 10-year horizon, make Canada a genuinely indispensable node in global manufacturing networks. None of this happens with a press release. It happens through thousands of individual commercial decisions made by firms responding rationally to the incentive structures that government policy creates. And the incentive structure that Washington has created over the past year: unpredictable tariffs, policy reversals driven by social media posts, the revocation of commitments made under prior arrangements, the treatment of long-established trade frameworks as negotiating leverage rather than foundational rules, has been extraordinarily effective at redirecting those commercial decisions toward Canada and away from the United States. Not permanently, not irreversibly in every case, but significantly enough that the structural adjustment will take years to undo, even if American policy were to stabilize tomorrow. I want to pause here and offer what I think is an important historical parallel, because context of this kind always illuminates better than the immediate drama of current events. What we are watching in the organization of the emerging middle power coalition around Canada's leadership is structurally similar to a process that occurred in the 1960s and 1970s, when Western European economies, having recovered from the devastation of the Second World War, began to collectively assert economic identities that were genuinely independent of American preferences. The formation of the European Economic Community, the currency arrangements that preceded the euro, the development of distinctly European approaches to competition policy, industrial strategy, and trade regulation, these were not hostile acts directed against the United States. They were the natural consequence of economic recovery combined with the recognition that dependence on a single external anchor, however friendly, created vulnerabilities that sophisticated governments had a responsibility to reduce. The American response to that process, at its most effective, was to recognize that the strengthening of Allied economic capacity served long-term American interests, even when it reduced American leverage in specific negotiations. A prosperous Europe was a more capable partner against shared adversaries, a more stable anchor for the international financial system, and a more reliable contributor to the collective goods that the Western alliance depended on. The short-term costs of reduced leverage were consistently outweighed by the long-term benefits of Allied strength. That was not a particularly difficult calculation to make, and American policymakers of both parties made it consistently for decades. What is different about the current moment is that the administration in Washington appears to be making the opposite calculation, treating Allied economic capacity as a threat to be contained rather than a resource to be cultivated. And that inversion of the historical logic is producing exactly the outcome you would expect. Allies are reducing their dependency not because they want less relationship with the United States, but because the American relationship has become structurally unreliable in ways that make prudent diversification a genuine necessity rather than a merely theoretical option. Canada's emergence as the organizing center of middle power trade architecture is, in this context, not a story about Canadian ambition or Canadian anti-Americanism. It is a story about the gap that forms when the traditional anchor of a system begins to behave in ways that are inconsistent with the anchor function. Someone fills that gap. The question was always which country would have the institutional capacity, the economic credibility, and the strategic vision to attempt it. Canada has answered that question, and the answer has surprised a Washington establishment that has consistently underestimated Ottawa's willingness to act decisively when the circumstances demanded it. I have been watching Canadian foreign economic policy for a long time, and what strikes me most about the current moment is the combination of ambition and restraint that marks Carney's approach. The ambition is visible in the scope of what is being assembled: 12 agreements, 4 continents, conversations with the EU and the Indo-Pacific Bloc and Beijing simultaneously, all within a single year of taking office. The restraint is visible in how it is being framed, always as bridge building, always as partnership, never as confrontation, never as an explicit challenge to American primacy. That combination is not accidental. It reflects a genuine understanding that the most durable changes to the international economic order are the ones that happen through the accumulation of relationships rather than through the declaration of new dispensations. You do not replace the old architecture by announcing that you are replacing it. You replace it by building the new one piece by piece until the old one becomes optional. That is what is happening. And by the time Washington fully appreciates the scope of what has been constructed, the structural adjustment will be sufficiently advanced that reversing it will require not merely the restoration of American reliability, but a sustained and demonstrable commitment to it over a period long enough to rebuild the confidence that has been lost. That is a project measured in years, not news cycles. And every week that passes without active American engagement in the relationships that are being quietly restructured is a week in which the new architecture becomes more settled, more institutionalized, and more resistant to the kind of reversal that a change in American posture might otherwise produce. What this moment ultimately reveals is something that I think deserves to be stated plainly, without the hedging that is sometimes mistaken for balance. American economic leadership in the Western world was never guaranteed by American size alone. It was maintained by the consistent exercise of a particular kind of responsibility, the responsibility to be reliable, to honor commitments, to sustain the frameworks of cooperation that produced shared prosperity, and to subordinate short-term leverage to long-term relationship quality. When that responsibility is abandoned, the leadership does not simply pause. It creates an opening. And in the current moment, that opening has been filled by a Canadian Prime Minister standing at a podium in Davos, telling the world's middle powers that they do not have to choose between great power patrons, that they can build something together, and that the rules-based order they believed in is not dead simply because its most powerful historical champion has decided it is inconvenient. History will record what Washington chose to do with the time that Canada's patient diplomacy was creating. It will record whether the biggest bargaining chip was eventually reclaimed through the hard work of restored credibility, or whether it was simply allowed to dissolve deal by deal, agreement by agreement, until the architecture it was supposed to anchor had been quietly and permanently replaced. Great powers do not lose influence because they are defeated. They lose it because they stop being worth the effort of maintaining the relationship.